He thought she was just another inexperienced attorney. Judge Nathaniel Thornton watched with thinly veiled contempt as Rebecca Morgan stood before his court in her simple gray cardigan. "Are you actually prepared to handle this case?" he mocked, expecting her to crumble. But when she began speaking, quoting precedents only seasoned lawyers would know, his smug smile vanished. This simple woman wasn't who she appeared to be, and she was about to teach him a lesson he'd never forget. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Rebecca Morgan's apartment as she stood before her mirror, methodically transforming herself. At 42, she was one of Chicago's most formidable civil rights attorneys, with a reputation that preceded her in courtrooms across the Midwest. Today, however, she wasn't dressing for success. She pulled her normally styled hair into a simple bun, removed her signature gold earrings, and traded her tailored suit for a modest gray cardigan and simple black slacks. She even switched her designer frames for an older, more subdued pair. "This has to work," she whispered to herself, studying her reflection. She thought back to the research she'd done on Judge Nathaniel Thornton. For 17 years, he presided over the Cook County Court with an iron fist and notorious bias. Corporate cases almost always swung in favor of big business, especially when argued by female attorneys, who he seemingly viewed as less competent by default. 4 months ago, Rebecca had been approached by representatives from Lakeview Shores, a retirement community housing primarily lower-income seniors. Grandview Development had set their sights on the property, intending to build luxury condominiums. Through dubious means and legal loopholes, they were close to forcing out dozens of elderly residents. The case had already been before Judge Thornton once, presented by a high-profile attorney who'd been practically laughed out of court. That's when Rebecca had been called in, but she knew appearing as herself wouldn't work. If he sees another polished Northwestern law attorney walking in, his mind will be made up before I speak, she had explained to her colleague Marcus. Marcus had been skeptical. "So your plan is to what? Pretend to be inexperienced, Rebecca? That's risky if he finds out." "I'm not going to lie," she had clarified. "I'm just not going to correct assumptions. I've just moved to this jurisdiction. He doesn't know me yet." Now, as she gathered her deliberately worn leather briefcase, she mentally reviewed the strategy. Today wasn't about winning outright. It was about laying groundwork, getting Thornton to underestimate her. Then, when the time was right, she would reveal her true capabilities. Rebecca's phone buzzed. A text from Eleanor Winters, the 81-year-old resident who had become the face of Lakeview Shores fight. "We're all counting on you, dear. God bless." Rebecca took a deep breath. She wasn't just fighting for a legal victory. She was fighting for people's homes, their dignity, their community. At the courthouse, she blended in with the crowd, nothing about her commanding attention. Several attorneys nodded politely but distantly as she passed, none recognizing her as the same Rebecca Morgan who had successfully argued before the Supreme Court 3 years prior. Inside the courtroom, she spotted the opposition. 3 Grandview attorneys in impeccable suits, led by Thomas Reynolds, known for his aggressive tactics and deep corporate connections. He barely glanced at her as she took her seat at the plaintiff's table. "Are you the paralegal?" he asked dismissively. "I'm representing Lakeview Shores today," she replied simply. Reynolds smirked, turning back to his colleagues with a poorly concealed chuckle. His body language screamed, "This will be easy." Eleanor and 5 other elderly residents filed in, sitting directly behind Rebecca. Eleanor squeezed her shoulder. "Thank you for taking this on, Ms. Morgan. We couldn't afford another big-name lawyer after the last one." Rebecca smiled reassuringly. Sometimes the unexpected approach works best. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Nathaniel Thornton." Thornton entered, his tall frame and silver hair giving him a commanding presence. His eyes, cold and assessing, swept over the courtroom before he took his seat. He shuffled papers for a moment before looking up, his gaze landing first on Reynolds and his team with something like collegial recognition. Then his eyes shifted to Rebecca, narrowing slightly. "I see we have new counsel for the plaintiffs," he remarked, making no effort to mask the skepticism in his voice. "Let's hope we don't waste the court's time today." Rebecca maintained a neutral expression, knowing the performance had already begun. She had studied 18 of Thornton's previous cases involving housing disputes. She knew his tendencies, his biases, and most importantly, his blind spots. "Your Honor," she said, making her voice just slightly less confident than her usual courtroom tone, "we're prepared to proceed." Thornton looked at her over his reading glasses. "Are you? We'll see about that." Thomas Reynolds presented his case with the polish of a corporate attorney who'd never lost a night's sleep over the human cost of his victories. His argument was smooth, well-rehearsed, and laden with legal terminology designed to impress. "Your Honor, Grandview Development has followed every regulation to the letter. The zoning change was approved by the City Council. The property's current use is simply no longer economically viable." Reynolds concluded with practiced sincerity. Judge Thornton nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Clear and concise, as always." He then turned to Rebecca, his expression shifting to one of thinly veiled impatience. "Ms. Morgan, your response." Rebecca stood, deliberately arranging her notes with slightly fumbling fingers, a small performance for her audience of one. She noticed Thornton checking his watch. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, but lacking the commanding presence she typically brought to courtrooms. Lakeview Shores has been home to over 60 senior citizens for more than 20 years. The residents have legal leases that— "Ms. Morgan," Thornton interrupted, "I'm well aware of what a lease is. What I need are legal arguments, not emotional appeals." Several of the Grandview attorneys smirked, exactly as Rebecca had anticipated. "Of course, Your Honor. I apologize," she said, appearing slightly flustered. "The residents contest the validity of the zoning change on the grounds that proper notification procedures weren't followed." Thornton sighed audibly. "And your evidence for this claim?" "We have affidavits from residents stating they never received the legally required notices," Rebecca responded, sliding documents forward. "Affidavits can be prepared by anyone, Ms. Morgan. Do you have anything substantive?" Reynolds interjected, "Your Honor, we have signed receipts showing all notifications were delivered as required by statute." Thornton nodded. "Indeed, Ms. Morgan. This seems like a straightforward matter of documentation, which your clients lack." Rebecca hesitated deliberately, then pressed on. "Your Honor, there's also the matter of the historical significance of the property, which would require additional review before redevelopment." The judge removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Ms. Morgan, is this your first major case?" The courtroom fell silent. Even Reynolds looked uncomfortable at the direct confrontation. "I've handled various matters, Your Honor," Rebecca answered truthfully, if incompletely. "I thought as much," Thornton said with evident condescension. "Let me explain something," Thornton continued, leaning forward with a patronizing tone that echoed through the quiet courtroom. "Perhaps in law school, they told you that passion counts for something in court. It doesn't. Evidence does. Precedent does. And so far, you've presented me with neither." The elderly residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Edina's face had fallen. "Do you have actual legal arguments to present, or shall we end this exercise?" Thornton concluded. Rebecca remained standing, absorbing the humiliation without visible reaction. This was the moment she'd expected. Thornton putting her in her place, establishing dominance, showing everyone that a simple-looking woman couldn't possibly challenge the system he represented. "Your Honor," she began, her voice soft, "may I have a moment to confer with my clients?" Thornton waved his hand dismissively. "Take 5 minutes. Then I'm making my ruling." As Rebecca turned to speak quietly with Eleanor and the others, Reynolds leaned back in his chair, already wearing the expression of a victor. Thornton shuffled papers, barely concealing his boredom. "Don't worry," Rebecca whispered to the seniors. "This is proceeding exactly as expected." Eleanor looked doubtful. "But he's not listening to anything you say." "He will," Rebecca assured her. "Just trust me." When she turned back to face the court, Rebecca allowed a subtle shift in her posture, straightening just slightly, squaring her shoulders in a way almost imperceptible to anyone not looking for it. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying the same unassuming tone, "I'd like to present evidence regarding Docket 73C, the property's classification under Municipal Code." Thornton frowned. "The defendant has already addressed the zoning issues." "Not zoning, Your Honor. Historical preservation eligibility under the Williamson precedent." A flicker of confusion crossed Thornton's face. Williamson v. Northeastern Development, 2011. The Seventh Circuit established that buildings housing predominantly elderly populations for over 20 years qualify for expedited historical review, even without prior designation. Thornton's eyes narrowed. This wasn't the fumbling he'd expected from her. "That case isn't relevant here," Reynolds cut in quickly. Rebecca kept her eyes on Thornton. "If I may explain the relevance, Your Honor." Thornton studied her for a moment, curiosity replacing some of his dismissiveness. "Proceed, Ms. Morgan. But be quick about it." The first tiny crack had appeared in his armor of certainty, and Rebecca was just getting started. Williamson established that elderly housing carries special consideration due to the vulnerable nature of the population and the disproportionate harm caused by displacement. Rebecca continued, her voice growing incrementally more assured. She pulled a document from her worn briefcase. "I've prepared a brief on Williamson and 3 subsequent cases that reinforce this precedent." Thornton accepted the document with visible reluctance. "Ms. Morgan, I'm familiar with housing law. If this were applicable, surely Mr. Reynolds would have addressed it." "Perhaps Mr. Reynolds hoped it wouldn't be raised," Rebecca suggested, maintaining her unassuming demeanor while inserting the first hint of her actual confidence. Reynolds stood, his previous smugness faltering. "Your Honor, Williamson was a narrow ruling specific to Indiana properties. It has no bearing on Illinois law." Rebecca didn't miss a beat. "Actually, Your Honor, the Illinois Supreme Court cited Williamson favorably in Keller v. Chicago Housing Authority just last year. Page 47 of the ruling specifically extends the principle to all Midwestern states." Thornton flipped through the brief, his brow furrowing as he located the reference. The courtroom remained silent as he read, the atmosphere shifting perceptibly. "Furthermore," Rebecca continued while he read, "Lakeview Shores meets all 5 criteria established in Keller for emergency preservation status." She pulled another document from her briefcase. "I've outlined these points along with supporting documentation." Thornton looked up, studying Rebecca with new interest. The patronizing smile had vanished. "You seem surprisingly versed in preservation law, Ms. Morgan." "I find it's an overlooked area in housing disputes, Your Honor," she replied modestly. For the next 30 minutes, Rebecca methodically presented her arguments, each one revealing a deeper knowledge of precedent and statute than the last. She cited cases that even Thornton, with his 17 years on the bench, had to strain to recall. She referenced local ordinances with specific subsection numbers from memory, all while maintaining the appearance of someone who was simply well-prepared rather than expertly strategic. The elderly residents behind her began sitting straighter in their seats. Eleanor's face showed dawning hope. Across the aisle, Reynolds conferred urgently with his colleagues, papers shuffling as they scrambled to address points they clearly hadn't anticipated. "Your Honor," Reynolds interjected during a brief pause, "we request a short recess to review Ms. Morgan's claims." Thornton, still studying Rebecca with puzzled interest, nodded. 15 minutes. As Thornton stood to leave the bench, he added, "Ms. Morgan, I'd like to see counsel in my chambers." The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Rebecca and Reynolds followed the judge into his wood-paneled office. Thornton closed the door and turned to them, his expression guarded. "Mr. Reynolds, were you aware of these precedents?" Reynolds cleared his throat. "We examined relevant case law, Your Honor, but considered these particular cases distinguishable from the current situation." "Distinguished how?" Thornton pressed. Ms. Morgan's analysis of the parallels seems quite thorough. Rebecca remained silent, watching the dynamic shift. Thornton, who had dismissed her completely an hour ago, was now using her work to challenge Reynolds. Reynolds straightened his tie. "With all due respect, Your Honor, Ms. Morgan is overlooking key differences in property valuation and municipal interests." "I'm not overlooking them," Rebecca interjected calmly. "I've addressed them in Section 3 of my brief." The University of Chicago Law Review article by Professor Abernathy specifically refutes the valuation argument in similar cases. Thornton raised an eyebrow. "University of Chicago Law Review? You're familiar with Abernathy's work?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied simply. Thornton studied her with increasing curiosity. "Ms. Morgan, where did you study law?" The moment had arrived sooner than she'd expected. Rebecca met his gaze directly. "Northwestern, Your Honor. Class of 2006. Reynolds blinked in surprise. Thornton's expression remained unreadable. "And your practice? You're new to my courtroom." "I recently relocated to this jurisdiction. Previously, I practiced in Chicago, primarily handling civil rights and housing discrimination cases." Thornton leaned back against his desk. "Any cases I might recognize?" Rebecca allowed herself a small smile. "Perhaps Morgan versus Department of Housing and Urban Development." The change in Thornton's expression was subtle but unmistakable. Widened eyes, a momentary parting of lips. He knew that case. Everyone in legal circles did. It had gone to the Supreme Court 3 years ago and established new precedent for fair housing enforcement nationwide. "You're that Rebecca Morgan?" he asked, disbelief coloring his voice. "Yes, Your Honor." Reynolds looked between them, confusion evident on his face. Thornton straightened, his professional demeanor returning. "Let's get back to court. I believe we have matters to discuss." When court resumed, the atmosphere had transformed. Judge Thornton's demeanor toward Rebecca had shifted from dismissive to wearily respectful. He no longer interrupted her, instead listening intently as she continued her presentation. "Your Honor," Rebecca began, her voice now carrying more of its natural authority, "I'd like to introduce Exhibit C, the original community charter for Lakeview Shores." She approached the bench, handing over a document that looked significantly older than the others. This charter, established in 1978, includes a covenant that explicitly protects residents from displacement for commercial development. Thornton examined the document carefully. "This appears to be a private agreement, Ms. Morgan. Its enforceability against new ownership would be questionable." "Under normal circumstances, I would agree," Rebecca responded, a hint of her usual courtroom confidence now evident. However, in Latimer versus Crescent Development, the Illinois Supreme Court held that such covenants remain enforceable when incorporated into the original property deed, which this one was. She produced another document. The covenant was registered with the county as Addendum B to the property deed. "I've highlighted the relevant language." Reynolds stood abruptly. "Your Honor, we were never provided with this document during discovery." Rebecca turned to him calmly. "It was included in the second document production, Mr. Reynolds. Page 147 of the attachment to our response dated April 15th. Judge Thornton raised an eyebrow. "Is that correct, Mr. Reynolds?" The corporate attorney faltered, quickly conferring with his team. One of his associates nodded reluctantly, sliding a folder toward him. Reynolds' expression soared as he located the page Rebecca had referenced. "It appears it was included, Your Honor," he admitted. By now, the entire courtroom was watching the proceedings with rapt attention. The gallery had filled with additional spectators, word having spread that something unusual was unfolding in Thornton's courtroom. Ms. Morgan, Thornton said, studying her with newfound interest. You mentioned earlier that you've recently relocated to this jurisdiction. May I ask what brought you to this particular case? It was a deviation from the legal arguments, a personal question that judges rarely asked in open court. But Rebecca recognized it for what it was. Thornton trying to understand who she really was and why she presented herself as she had. I believe everyone deserves equal protection under the law, Your Honor, she replied, particularly those who might otherwise be overlooked by our legal system, such as elderly residents facing corporate development interests. Regardless of appearances, Thornton observed. Exactly, Your Honor. Thornton nodded slowly, then turned to Reynolds. Counselor, how does Grandview respond to this covenant issue? Reynolds straightened his tie, visibly thrown off balance. We maintain that subsequent zoning changes supersede the original covenant, Your Honor. Furthermore, the economic interests of the city. The economic interests, Rebecca interrupted with quiet intensity, do not outweigh the legal rights of these residents. Her posture had completely transformed now. She stood tall, her voice resonant with conviction. Ms. Morgan, Thornton said, you've presented a remarkably thorough case today. One might wonder why such understated presentation initially. The courtroom held its breath. This was Thornton acknowledging what had happened, his own dismissal of her based on appearances. Rebecca met his gaze directly. Your Honor, I've found that in life, as in law, people often see what they expect to see. These residents, she gestured to Eleanor and the others, are dismissed because they're elderly, on fixed incomes, not dressed in expensive clothes. Their legal rights remain, regardless of appearances. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Thornton's expression flickered between discomfort and admiration. Sometimes, Rebecca continued, the only way to demonstrate such bias is to experience it firsthand. Thornton leaned back, understanding dawning in his eyes. You deliberately presented yourself this way. I focused on the legal arguments, Your Honor. How those arguments were initially received was educational. Reynolds, sensing the shift in momentum, tried to regain control. Your Honor, while Ms. Morgan's theatrics are interesting, they don't change the legal reality that. Mr. Reynolds, Thornton interrupted, his tone sharp. I would reconsider characterizing counsel's approach as theatrics. The legal arguments Ms. Morgan has presented are substantive and merit serious consideration. Rebecca suppressed a smile. The transformation was complete. For the record, she said, reaching into her briefcase, I'd like to submit my credentials and bar admissions to this court. She handed the documents to the clerk. Including my role as lead counsel in Morganville HUD, and 7 other federal cases pertaining to housing rights. Thornton nodded, accepting the documents. So noted, Counselor. The title was deliberate, a professional acknowledgement he had withheld earlier. The message was clear to everyone present. Judge Nathaniel Thornton now saw Rebecca Morgan for exactly who she was. Judge Thornton cleared his throat, the courtroom silent as he prepared to deliver his ruling. The transformation in his demeanor toward Rebecca was apparent to everyone present. Gone was the condescension, replaced by professional respect. Based on the arguments and evidence presented today, I'm issuing a preliminary injunction against Grandview Development's planned eviction of Lakeview Shores residents, he announced. The covenant issue raised by Ms. Morgan presents significant legal questions that must be resolved before any development can proceed. Relieved gasps and muffled cheers came from the elderly residents. Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes, reaching forward to squeeze Rebecca's shoulder in gratitude. Furthermore, Thornton continued, I'm ordering an independent review of the zoning change process, based on the evidence suggesting proper notification procedures may not have been followed. He fixed Reynolds with a stern look. The court takes very seriously any potential irregularities in proceedings affecting vulnerable populations. Reynolds stood, composure faltering. Your Honor, This delay will cost my client millions. Your client's financial concerns do not override legal process, Mr. Reynolds, Thornton interrupted firmly. Perhaps that's something Grandview should have considered before pursuing this particular property. As Thornton concluded the proceedings, setting dates for further hearings, Rebecca gathered her materials calmly. The contrast between her simple appearance and commanding legal presence now seemed to fascinate rather than mislead those watching. Outside the courtroom, reporters had gathered, word having spread about the unexpected turn of events. Rebecca guided the elderly residents through the crowd, deflecting questions with practiced ease. Ms. Morgan, called one persistent reporter. Is it true you deliberately downplayed your credentials to expose judicial bias? Rebecca paused. I presented the legal arguments necessary to protect my clients' homes. How those arguments were received initially versus after my experience became known is something I'll leave for others to reflect upon. As they walked toward the courthouse steps, Judge Thornton emerged from a side door, clearly heading to his next appointment. Seeing Rebecca, he hesitated, then changed direction to approach her. Counselor, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. That was an effective demonstration. Rebecca met his gaze evenly. Thank you, Your Honor. I wonder, he continued, how many other attorneys have stood before me with valid arguments that I've overlooked due to similar assumptions. That's not for me to say, Judge Thornton, Rebecca replied. He nodded solemnly. No, but it's certainly for me to consider. He glanced at the elderly residents waiting nearby. You've given them a fighting chance. The law gave them that chance, Rebecca corrected gently. I simply ensured it was recognized. Thornton studied her for a moment longer. I look forward to seeing you in my courtroom again, Ms. Morgan. Though perhaps next time, there will be less need for strategic presentation. With a brief nod, he continued on his way, the encounter unnoticed by the busy courthouse crowd. Eleanor approached, her eyes bright with tears of relief. You did it, Rebecca. You actually did it. Rebecca smiled, placing an arm around the older woman's shoulders. This is just the beginning, Eleanor. But today, we made them see you, really see you. As they descended the courthouse steps together, Rebecca reflected on the day's events. She had entered that courtroom knowing exactly what would happen, how she would be dismissed, underestimated, nearly humiliated. But she had also known that sometimes the only way to change a biased system was to expose it from within. Today, in Judge Thornton's courtroom, justice hadn't just been served in the legal sense. A deeper truth had been revealed. That worth and capability had nothing to do with appearance, and that assumptions, even from those in positions of authority, could be profoundly wrong. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca's victory at Lakeview Shores became a talking point in legal circles throughout the state. Judge Thornton, true to the moment of reflection he'd shared with her, began earning a reputation for more equitable treatment of all attorneys appearing in his court. As for Rebecca Morgan, she continued her work, sometimes in designer suits, sometimes in simple cardigans, but always with the same brilliant legal mind and unwavering dedication to justice. That morning, as she prepared for another case, she paused before her mirror. The woman who looked back at her wasn't defined by her clothes or appearance. Her strength came from something far more significant: her knowledge, her compassion, and her unwillingness to let anyone's preconceptions stand in the way of justice. With a satisfied smile, she picked up her briefcase and headed out, ready for whatever challenges awaited.